Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, August 20th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2 in this three-part series, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers and Extreme Heat, in which we'll be looking into the evidence of very high temperatures and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. Now, Andy Steele is normally with us, but he's going to be occupied today. But he's available for any glitches that might happen. But for that reason and for other reasons, we're not going to take questions today. So relax and save up those questions. You can still submit them. We'll try to get to them next week or next month when we do part 3 again. Just so you know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and the construction administration for these $3 and $10 million. Excuse me. Let me get the right slide up here for you. Where'd it go? Here. There we go. This construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before working full-time on the important outreach effort of AE 9/11 Truth, I had similar responsibilities working on the construction and documents for this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas, with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's get right into it here. We have 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition for some very important reasons. One of those is that we use the scientific method here at AE 9/11 Truth. We've had it in the West for 100 years or so. It helps us winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. And we have a question. How do the towers come down? We do some background research, make some observations. How have other towers come down, for instance? Make some predictions based on those hypotheses, like, for instance, maybe it was the jet planes that brought the towers down. Maybe it was the ensuing fires or explosions. All reasonable hypotheses. We don't fix ourselves onto one particular hypothesis due to, for instance, financial or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter of whether a particular collapse is by explosions or fires or controlled demolition. Another rational hypothesis looking at the evidence that we're going to be seeing today. And so we test those hypotheses with experiments. We draw conclusions after analyzing the results. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis until we find one that is standing up against the evidence and then is supported and is corroborated. So that's what we're going to be about today, looking first at some of the things that destroy buildings. For instance, fire is certainly one of them. It's an organic process, moves through the building in about 20 minutes or so. That's all the fuel there is in a modern office skyscraper, for instance, to burn. So even NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, says that these fires didn't persist in any one location. for more than about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And yet this completely defies their massive engulfing fires theory for Building 7 and the Twin Towers. But skyscrapers have not collapsed due to fires before, steel frame fireproof skyscrapers. But in a wood frame building, we'd expect the building to fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the tons of structure that's hard, cold, intact. No, the building obey the laws of entropy. It's a chaotic, very organic process, if you will. And how might we expect steel frame buildings to behave? Well, there was a test. They built an 8-story building in 1995 in the UK, set it on fire. Incredible fuel loads, as you can see in the office here. And what happens in this fire? Well, let's listen to the fire protection engineer, Jonathan Barnett.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire, which is why we have so many architects and engineers examining this. Well, what is our conclusion in this report? That it's inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. You can see the connections don't fail. The beams will warp, they'll sag, especially when they're not fireproofed, which in this case, in this study, they had half the beams and columns unfireproofed, and they still did not fail. This is extremely important. They tried to reach up to 2,000-degree fires in this case with no fireproofing, and still no major failures. Let's look at buildings, tall buildings that have had major failures. In this case, natural collapses, in this case due to earthquakes. We have a building that falls over to the path of least resistance. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. It doesn't collapse into its individual structural components. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So if we keep this in mind, because we're going to be comparing this to the Twin Towers collapse. Actually, we did very, very acutely last week. And so if you missed part 2 in this 3-part series, I encourage you to look search on YouTube for part 2, 9/11, An Architect's Guide. And that was called Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. So in this case, with buildings exploding, what do we have here? We would be looking for thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds that are expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the ignition of the gases and from these explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Now, explosions are not a part of the official narrative of the destruction of the Twin Towers, except for those explosions at the beginning with the jet planes. And last week, we saw all kinds of evidence of explosions, right? This week, we're going to be looking at something a little different, something we wouldn't expect in a normal controlled demolition, which can be used to bring down tall buildings also. Well, we have thousands of cases around the world to evaluate the typical features that are associated with these controlled demolitions, because what they do is place thousands of cutter charges around the columns and beams and then detonate them in a very precise order, starting usually at the bottom, but not always, and bringing the building down with a set of features. Let's look at those features. We looked last week, we found there was a sudden onset of destruction. in the Twin Towers. A straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint because the columns are removed very precisely and very quickly to allow that symmetry, resulting also in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, but somehow that resistance was moved. We're going to be looking at that somehow today. This resulted in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, so it's broken up ready for loading and shipment, with minimal damage to adjacent structures, not in the case of the Twin Towers. This is typical controlled demolition. They try to control that. We saw last week that was not very well controlled in the case of the Twin Towers at all. Very explosive event. There's patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses. We looked at that last week. Broken up concrete floors. Of course, you don't want to have to go back in a typical controlled demolition and break those up with jackhammers. Let the explosives do that work. And then so we have explosive charges or squibs that we saw last week visible in many of the floors. And then chemical evidence left behind, which we looked at last week, and we will be looking at a lot more of this week. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. So fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. So let's look at some buildings that have had incredible, fully engulfed fires, and yet no collapse.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, it certainly didn't. Neither did this World Trade Center building fire, fully engulfed, right? Building 5 did not collapse. Mid-rise, high-rise, fire-protected structures that have not come down, not after 9/11 either, as you can see in these fully engulfed buildings and these post 9/11 fires. And yet these fires with small flames and black smoke indicating the oxygen-starved and cooler fires were said to have brought this building down after just an hour of burning. Substantially, the fires. Of course, there were damaged columns too. We looked at that last week. So why not? Well, we have the steel that conducts the heat away from the source. It's keeping that steel from getting to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. So that's the critical thing we don't want to happen there. And so we fireproof the beams and columns, 2 and 3 hour fire protection, up to 6 times more fire protection than is needed for the 20 to 30 minutes that NIST even admits that fires can burn in a given area. So the fire protection should be substantial. In the case of the Twin Towers, NIST claims that the airplanes stripped off all the fireproofing essentially all the way around the building, which is ludicrous. The buildings are built out of non-combustible materials. The tenants can't bring in all kinds of fuel loads in these Class A fire skyscrapers. Also, we put fire sprinklers in to keep anything from becoming a problem. In the case of the towers, it's said that the impact of the airplanes disrupted the fire sprinkler suitability, functioning. So we have additional circumstantial corroborative evidence that can be very helpful. Government documentation, when we have that available, yeah, that can prove a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge, that people know about it in advance, can be very helpful. Experts agreeing, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a particular building has been destroyed by controlled demolition or by fire. Video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. A model of proof that we're going to just apply to the Twin Towers. Last week, we applied the first key points to, all of which is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. This week, we're going to be moving on and looking at pyroclastic-like clouds with extreme heat. Let's get right into it. The National Fire Protection Association, the Guide 921 for fire investigation and fire explosion, says, look for thermal effects. Now, NIST acknowledges that they did not do this, but what we have is large volumes of gas, they say, and look for a large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Gosh, do we have that? Yeah, all the photos, all the videos show these incredible plumes of hot gases in these rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped formations, racing 35 miles an hour away from the Twin Towers in every direction and expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. This takes an incredible amount of heat to accomplish. And that heat is not available in the diminished fires that were at the time of the collapse. In fact, these fires are probably put out at the onset of the collapse. So where's all this heat coming from? Something on the order of this is what we'll be looking for, and we'll be finding it today as we look first at the evidence of extreme heat here from Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out? There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still I believe 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a board at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. It was just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
We would create an air pocket by moving the steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot-long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Worksite, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's when the fire's going to still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
3 months? How about these structural engineers and others? Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile, they say. Dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. The president of the cleanup company saw pools of literally molten steel. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal still red-hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked from hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam, says this firefighter. Molten steel beams. The end of this beam would be dripping with molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of the cleanup company, he's the president also of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, who had a contract cleaning this stuff up. Molten steel was encountered during the excavation of debris. There are videotape and photos of this molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. A river of steel flowing. Who says this? The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, and his associate, Richard Garlock, who says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, as you see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse as well. NIST, again, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, says this must be melted airplane. Well, molten aluminum looks silvery in daylight conditions. It doesn't glow bright yellow and white hot like you saw there and like you see here, dripping out of the material held in the hands of this crab claw excavator. And I didn't even know concrete could melt, but here I saw it myself at the New York Police Museum. Concrete melts at about 3,200 degrees. Says the fire temperature is so intense the concrete melted like lava around everything in its path. What can melt concrete? As it's flowing around this handgun in the police museum. It was underneath building 6, they say. So partly evaporated beams, steel members, and the debris pile that appeared to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Wait a minute. The New York Times reports this. This is a quote from the fire protection engineer, Jonathan Barnett. But there's a problem. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. Where are these temperatures coming from that are doing that? And this to this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel that Abolhaz Nastani Azel, a structural engineer, professor at UC Berkeley, National Science Foundation grant recipient to study this steel, documents. If you remember the Salvador Dali paintings, like the clocks that are kind of melted, it can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. Let's look a little deeper.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
And it's documented by FEMA as well, who had the earlier contract to study the collapse of these buildings, the destruction of these buildings. They had a whole appendix on the metallurgical examination of this steel. What did they find? Thinned to almost razor sharpness, a 1-inch column reduced to 1/2-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll. How does this happen? It doesn't happen in normal office fires. What does it take to happen? What does it take for rapid oxidation and sulfidation and intergranular melting? Liquid iron, that's molten iron, documented by Worcester Polytechnic University and included in Appendix C of the FEMA report in 2002, which was completely overturned by NIST when they came in and took over the investigation and ditched this entire report. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation for the source of sulfur, though. They don't know where the sulfur could have come from. NIST speculates, the New York Times says this is the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, and yet it's omitted from the NIST report. They speculate, oh gosh, NIST says in their very frequently asked questions, sulfur is present in the gypsum wallboard that's prevalent in the interior partitions. Well, wait a minute. Gypsum wallboard contains inert calcium sulfate, not sulfur. It's never turned around in its 100-year history and attacked the steel that it has been designed to protect. And experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. Let's do an experiment. Here's a 2,000-degree fire with lots of gypsum wallboard placed against this steel beam. Did it turn around and attack it? Let's see. Nope. Clean as a whistle. Yet that smell of sulfur permeated the World Trade Center. Where was it coming from? It burned. The smell of sulfur. You can never block out that smell. It haunts me, says John Field, a demolition worker at the World Trade Center. And yet, regarding this evidence, here's John Gross, co-project leader of the NIST report, denying it.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
but witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry, like lava.
I actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
They pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
So here he is, though, standing on the pile, finding the very piece of steel that was handed to FEMA, in which they documented partly evaporated ends of beams, Jonathan Barnett's quote there, and the silver dollar size holes and the edges curled like a paper scroll. His shadow is all over the evidence. Well, how do we get those kinds of temperatures? One supporter of the official story, Thomas Iger, says that maybe the temperatures are 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit in this steel. Well, gosh, hydrocarbons, buildings, and jet fuel burning in open air only produce 600 to 1,400 degree temperatures. And so that can't, even according to ME Petroleum, chief manufacturer of kerosene, which is jet fuel, which jet fuel basically is, 600 degrees maximum. So what could have caused this melting of the steel? We can tell because the physics of molten iron and steel is such that by its color, you can tell its temperature. Here, exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, more than twice what normal office fires or jet fuel certainly can get to. And so what caused this stuff to melt? Well, NIST has a question and an answer to a very frequently asked question. Any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile, rather than short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Oh yeah, there's a law. It's called the conservation of energy. In a closed system, such as fires burning under this incredible tons of concrete powder that we saw in last week's part 2 of this series, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create more energy inside this system. In other words, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. You can only convert that energy you have from one form to another. In other words, the heat is dissipated. It's not increased. What could have caused all of this evidence that we're looking at for incendiaries here, which we're going to be seeing now? Could thermite be responsible for this heat? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Interesting. So we're getting somewhere here maybe, because if thermite were used, it would account for the iron, elemental iron. We haven't used iron in skyscrapers, pure iron, for 100 years. And yet you're going to see, you're going to see in a few minutes that there's elemental iron all over the place. It would account for the extreme heat, because it produces 4,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures as one of its byproducts. Would also account for the sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So was this guide followed? The National Fire Protection Association Guide 921? Not by NIST, because they say look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later, when pressed, they finally admit NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. Anybody see a problem here? Others tested for it. It wasn't that hard to find, by the way. Here's Dr. Stephen Jones, a nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. He does some basic analysis and says, gosh, if the thermite were used, you'd expect a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like you see pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. You'd expect to see white cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like you see rising off the top of this material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse, and like you see chasing these freely flying structural steel sections that we looked at last week. Steel is not flammable under normal office fires. We looked at the trajectory in last week's part 2 of this series in some detail. Now we're looking at the white cloud. Steel's not on fire. And if it were on fire, which it obviously is here, how did it get on fire? What caught it on fire? Not normal office fires, certainly not jet fuel, which burns at 600 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't burn steel. 600 degrees Fahrenheit in open air. This looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009 with outward arching streamers, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, a geometry of fireworks. No, something else is going on here besides a collapse, huh? Look at both collapses. They are identical. And how do steel beams get on fire?
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
Well, how would that even happen? Dr. Jones says, well, let's look and leave, because thermite would leave behind unique chemical evidence such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, which is more common, but also very unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese, which you'd only expect in a thermite signature. These elements on the periodic table of the elements. Well, somebody sent him a piece of this chunk, 40-pound chunk of previously molten metal. They called them meteorites. This one's from the South Tower because they look like a meteorite has been through this incredible high heat event that's unexplainable in the official narrative of the destruction of these towers. He does electron microprobe data, finding it's predominantly iron, so he can rule out aluminum from the jet planes right away. It's got abundant manganese. So this is not melted structural steel. Structural steel is an alloy that does not have abundant manganese, right? So it has aluminum, sulfur, and potassium. So he finds that this is the signature of the residue of thermite. Well, what's that doing in the ends of the steel beams? The steel material and iron material. Manganese and fluorine in abundance. Direct evidence of signature. Where would they come from? Well, manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels. So these are clearly a part of the thermite fingerprint. Additional support for that hypothesis, if not proof itself. But sol gels would leave quite a residue. 1,3-diphenyl propane. Did they find that? One molecule present at levels that dwarfed all others in the EPA analysis of the dust. Dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Not common office fires. No. Oh, the World Trade Center steel was analyzed also from this sculpture at the International Peace Park in Manitoba. These sculptures were sent all over the world. Here's a piece of slag. The sculptor sent Stephen Jones because he heard about the work he was doing. So Jones does X-ray fluorescence analysis. What does he find? Iron, sulfur, potassium, aluminum, manganese, the ingredient, the signature of the residue of expended or ignited thermite. Well, you can make thermite cutter charges in your own backyard, as civil engineer John Cole did in Florida. Here, let's look at a few.
That was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait a minute. Where did we see that before? Oh yeah, in the steel documented by FEMA and Worcester Polytechnic University in their study in the Appendix C of the FEMA report that NIST deleted when they took over the investigation, thinned to almost razor sharpness. Well, there are much more effective devices for bringing down buildings with thermite, like this one invented prior and patented prior to 9/11, which issues molten streams of iron in just hundreds of milliseconds. Much more effective than cutting through very thick sections of steel, like 4-inch thick sections that they had at the World Trade Center near the bottom of the building. You can also use consumable consolidated thermite for devices like these, like this igniter, whose case itself is composed of thermite. So there's nothing left behind except pools of molten iron, which you saw witness evidence of, testimony. But what else was found in all the World Trade Center dust? Spread 4-inch thick blanket across lower Manhattan. The U.S. Geological Survey finds in all of their samples, in just 2005 report, molten iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair, typically. They are previously molten, they're iron, and they're spherical. Each of these characteristics of this puzzled them greatly because they didn't expect to find them, and they can't and won't explain them. But up to 6% of the volume of these material, I think it's a weight, of these dust samples is molten iron microspheres, which they can't identify the origin of. It's up to about 4 tons of this material altogether by extrapolation. Well, it's not background dust. RJ Lee Group, independent environmental firm, says these are very different than that, and they were formed during the event, not before, by the iron workers who were building the towers, or afterward by the iron workers who were dismantling the towers, but during the event. An incredible high heat event producing 4 tons of molten iron microspheres. There's so many that are used as a signature component to distinguish the World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these previously molten iron microspheres. Well, where would they have come from? Well, here's a thermite experiment. Let's look at it. Very small, controlled experiment producing thousands of what? They look like sparks, but they're molten iron spheres which cool and fall and into these into the pan. Why are they spherical? Well, aerosolized liquids form spheres. That's the surface tension. That's how that happens. And if they're molten iron, they cool maybe after they hit. Could that be what's explaining the tops of these toasted cars around the World Trade Center? Liquid molten iron droplets. Okay, well, where did they come from? Let's look and see what else was found, in this case by a team of international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, who study the dust and find that all 7 samples actually had curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, indicating they were liquid applied, so they thought they were paint. But they're attracted by a magnet. So they go, gosh, this is not paint. What else can we learn here? They zoom into the, do analysis on the red side, and they, with X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, find aluminum, silica, iron, oxygen, carbon. So you have the key ingredients of unignited thermite, aluminum and iron oxide powder. Iron oxide is basically rust. Aluminum powder together creates thermite. And so they get real curious here. What's thermite doing in the World Trade Center dust? They zoom in 50,000 times and find these rhomboidal-shaped iron oxide crystals and these aluminum platelets at the nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. How did those get there? They're set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic material is what is used in TNT, or high energy explosives, to expand rapidly, producing the concussive blast. So here we have an incendiary which destroys by means of heat, seemingly engineered to become more explosive. In fact, at about 758 degrees Fahrenheit, these chips, when set in this heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, ignite. And this is produced in the peer-reviewed literature. It's called super thermite. Lawrence Livermore Lab and Los Alamos Lab have produced this stuff prior to 9/11. Well, these spheres did the same thing as the super thermite. All of them. Not these spheres. These red-gray chips that were found in the World Trade Center dust and given to this team of 8 scientists by independently collected because people had heard about their work. Well, what happens when they ignite? They produce what? Oops. Here we go. They produce spheres, molten iron spheres, with the same chemical signature as the molten iron spheres that are found and analyzed in the World Trade Center dust by so many others. So we know where these spheres came from. They came from these chips, these red-gray chips, as if we didn't know, because they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips from the dust samples, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that can be used as evidence in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice, whoever they are. And they shouldn't be that hard to find. This material is extremely sophisticated, not made in a cave in Afghanistan. The 25-page peer-reviewed paper on this study is produced in the Bentham Chemical Physics Journal in 2009. The red layer of the red grade chips is active, unreacted thermitic materials. Hold on a second. I'm going to have to start this because we lost the presenter view. Hold on one second. We're going to bring that right back and start that show from here. We're going to find our place there, and here. There you go. No. Let's try that again. Hang on one second. We're going to start it right here. There you go. So this is very sophisticated material, and you'll find it in the 25-page peer-reviewed paper here in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. This is what we've seen in this part 3 is direct evidence of explosive destruction and incendiary destruction, particularly. A fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. Especially these fires, which are diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated also by the, you have to force the national agencies like NIST to release information in a FOIA request, Freedom of Information. We find in there thermal imaging videos that prove that these fire temperatures were extremely low, 200-300 degrees maximum, near the time of the collapse. And this is well before the collapse even. So experts, what do they say? Well, we have 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation. Here's one of them. Ron Brookman doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable, as NIST claims? Why would all 110 stories drop straight to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer. The fires were very weak. NIST reports confirm that the steel temperatures were low. World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise collapse. How about the evidence? Surely in easily the most puzzling structural failures in modern history, the steel was kept and preserved so investigators could do a proper forensic examination. Let's listen to one of them.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling before he could get his hands on it and do a proper, complete forensic examination. Mayor Mike Bloomberg, justifying this, says just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. This guy's an engineer. Obviously, old Pucky, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately, but it didn't. It started just 2 weeks after 9/11, this removal of evidence with Building 7, and continued at 400 truckloads a day. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. What are they trying to hide? And what has the scientific method, what is it showing? Is it showing destruction by jet planes, by fire, by explosions, or by controlled demolition? Probably the combination of the latter two is what the architects and engineers who have looked at this evidence and thus have formed an informed opinion on the matter, and which is what you've done now if you've been with us here for the last hour, at least for this part 3. You really need to watch all 3 of these. But in part 3, we showed features 8, 9, and 10. The very uncharacteristic features, but nevertheless of controlled demolition. And we looked at features 1 through 7 last week, altogether 10 features pointing to direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony, eyewitnesses, and so forth, videos. This is all proof of controlled demolition, prompting 3,000 architects and engineers to sign on to the petition demanding a new investigation. So if you want to ask questions, you can do that on our website, but we will not be able to answer them today. Unfortunately, we have a short period of time to operate in today, particularly, but we'll bring those answers back to you next week. So right there, and while you're there, subscribe to our bulletins, where you can get updates and all the news, the efforts we're getting toward a real investigation, the additional evidence and the efforts that are happening, lots of them now. But you can get informed just on our website. There's an incredible evidence section available for you with more video evidence and documentation, articles that are very well done. Sign the petition while you're there. Support the 3,000 architects and engineers. You don't have to be an architect. We have 20,000 other supporters. And donate to AE 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization all over the place doing all kinds of activities. Right now, we're raising a lot of dollars for Matt Campbell. And we'll be showing you how you can help with that effort. Matt Campbell lost his brother Jeff in the North Tower. He was blown up in the controlled demolition of that tower. We're going to be submitting a petition for an inquest into his brother's death. And one of the top barristers in the country is going to be handling that. So you can donate here for that project. It's a $100,000 fundraising goal for the next month. So I encourage you to join us and become a member of AE 9/11 Truth. Also, for the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you're a member. You've joined the family of sustaining supporters that keep us doing what we do best, as at the tip of the spear of the 9/11 Truth movement. We can't afford to fail. 9/11 is the domino that knocks the other ones over. We've got to get people, the media, our elected representatives, and the public aware of and screaming for justice regarding 9/11. So volunteer with us. There's so many things you can do. We have a great volunteer team led by Andy Steele, who has all kinds of tasks that you could help us with if you're not able to donate particularly. And things you can do out on your own. Contact your elected representative, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everyone you know. Screen these DVDs. Share the brochures one-on-one. You can get 100 of them for $10, the evidence brochure, and hand them out, particularly to every architect and engineer you can find, but everybody else that you know. Everybody needs to become aware of 9/11. It's not just about these buildings, and it's not just about the 3,000 people who were murdered on that day. It's a whole lot bigger deal than that, as you can begin to imagine the level of conspiracy that we're talking about here to plan, execute, and get away with and cover up these crimes, this crime of the century. which is one of the reasons the University of Alaska got involved, because they said, gosh, Building 7 couldn't have come down by fire. So they spent 4 years studying it. And you, our supporters, make that happen. And they found through, in the end, that fire didn't cause the collapse of Building 7, that it didn't even experience a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. What does that? Controlled demolition, obviously, which is why we're educating 75,000 through the mailing of 75,000 cards to engineers all across the country, which is why we have an online conference, Justice Rising, this September 11th, 12th, and 13th. Join us for each evening. We'll be joined by Matt Campbell, who I mentioned, a family member, Ted Walter and Tony Zambodi on the request for correction with NIST, and Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquirer will have an update with their incredible activities on Friday night. And then on Science Saturday, Dylan Avery will talk about his new film 7, which is coming out about the same time. And Roland Angle will be giving a presentation on the Halsey study. Dr. Halsey himself will be here Saturday night. And David Ray Griffin, Niels Harrod, and Stephen Jones, pioneers in the 9/11 truth movement, whom we haven't heard much from in many, many years. We will be looking forward to a roundtable discussion with the wisdom gained from these very special mentors of mine personally in the 9/11 truth movement. And then Big Picture Sunday, Daniela Genzer, the Rutherford Institute's John Whitehead, and James Corbett, of course, with the Corbett Report. All of that, stay tuned. You can learn more on our website about that conference too at ae911truth.org. This is what has in part attracted the attention of New York area fire commissioners who have voted unanimously for a new investigation, who are supporting the request for correction that's gone to NIST, which is now imminently expected their response, this 100-page request for correction citing all of or most of the fraud. We can't get all of it. It would be 1,000 pages, this RFC. So very exciting opportunities here. We want you to also set up a meeting with your elected representative. We will be there on the phone giving the presentation for 10 minutes for you. All you have to do is set up the meeting and tell us when it is, and tell them it's about the Bobby McIlvaine Act. Bobby died in the tower. His father has inspired a massive effort to have a new investigation into the World Trade Center. And this is how we're going to do it. It's all written out. We have already given the legislation to every member of Congress and tried to encourage them to introduce it on either the House side or the Senate side. We've also got a grand jury investigation started. That is to say, we have a promise from the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, who's now been replaced by Trump, and we expect results to happen as a result of that now. 60 exhibits of our evidence gone forth. And our evidence has also been given to the FBI, but they didn't give it to Congress. And that's why we're demanding in this lawsuit against the FBI that they come forth, can come clean and give this evidence to Congress, as Congress requested, demanded of the FBI, that they give all the evidence that they have had since the publishing of the 9/11 Commission report. And so we have every reason to believe that will turn out successfully too. So if you really want to know what's going on with regard to this evidence, I encourage you to watch our landmark documentary here, where we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. Here's just a 4-minute taste.
me involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, scientific research politicized, in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
But this is, and it's free on YouTube, and you can watch it, 1 hour version, or you can watch the 1.5 hour version, which is incredible because it has additional work from the psychologists who explore why this evidence is so difficult to get a grip on, to get people to look at it even, and also extended interviews in the Meet the Experts DVD. So I encourage you to grab that on our at our online store at ae911truth.org. You can download also the Beyond Misinformation booklet, 50 pages of evidence, very well put together, free, the PDF. You can download it, or you can get the I think it's $10, the not hard copy, but coffee table quality, excellent production value on this 50-page booklet. Our classic 9/11 Blueprint for Truth is available, also free on YouTube, as is The Mystery of World Trade Center 7, the 15-minute video narrated by actor Ed Asner. Very well done. As I mentioned earlier, you can ask questions. We won't be able to answer them today because we're going to be rolling out of the studio real quick here. But what we've been looking at is part 3 of the 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide, the Twin Towers and Extreme Heat. Last week, we looked at part 2, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction, all free on YouTube archives. So just search for them. And we'll come back in September with our 3-part series, starting the first Thursday in September, Pacific time, 1 p.m. Part 1, World Trade Center Building 7, the third, I didn't know there was 4, the third high-rise that collapsed on 9/11 that most people, architects and engineers included, don't even know about. 47 stories. After witnesses hear explosions, free fall straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. And that just doesn't happen. That's exactly like the old hotels that came down by explosive demolition, and we proved just that. So today was part 3, and I encourage you to come back in September when we start up again, the first Thursday. And until then, thanks for attending, and share and like and subscribe to AE 9/11 Truth on YouTube, and pass this around. It's not going to get seen unless you pass it around. If you think it's important, do something. Thanks so much.